On the 22nd of December 2014, Glasgow's city centre was full of people making last-minute festive preparations.
It was really busy. It was 3 days before Christmas. And that part of Glasgow has the justified reputation of being one of the busiest areas for shopping in Britain.
My friend was home from Canada for the holidays and she wanted to meet for lunch, so I ended up getting dressed and going into the city centre. So we ended up on Queen Street just purely through chance and had our lunch. We were just getting up to leave when just all of this screaming broke out in Queen Street outside.
At 2:30 in the afternoon, reports came in of an incident involving a bin lorry in the city's George Square.
The scene was just really strange because at the time it didn't occur to me there was no traffic on the street and there were people walking around, and I couldn't initially quite make out what had happened. And then I saw that there were people lying on the ground, and I went to the end of the street, and as I looked up I saw the bin lorry going into the Millennium Hotel. But at the time I didn't know what had happened. I didn't see any significance to that.
When we looked further down the street, very quickly we were aware that this had hit people in its path.
There was a girl lying in the middle of the road and there was nobody really around her, so I went over to try and help her. And initially she wasn't conscious, but then she came round. So I was just on the ground trying to help her and just talking to her and trying to be of some support to her.
For speaking to people, they were describing a scene of carnage. They were describing screams filling the air. We knew that this was catastrophic for some people, and I think we knew very quickly, I would say within about 15 minutes of being on the scene, that there was going to be a huge loss of life here.
As darkness fell, more information about the incident became known.
About 2:30 this afternoon, a council bin lorry was making its way up Queen Street. It mounted the pavement. It didn't stop there. It continued northerly towards Queen Street Station before slamming into the Millennium Hotel.
All of that took 19 seconds. And in that 19 seconds, the bin lorry was veering, it was hitting buildings, it was bumping into walls. There was no logic to what was happening.
I'm sure I am speaking on behalf of everybody in the country when I say all of our thoughts and prayers are with those affected, and in particular those who are coming to terms this evening with the loss of a loved one.
6 people lost their lives that afternoon, including 3 members of the same family. 9 people were hospitalised, having sustained serious injuries. In the months following the tragedy, focus turned to understanding how the crash had occurred.
The police came out very quickly and said, this is a dreadful accident, this is a tragic accident, and they were appealing for witnesses. And of course, what it transpired not that much later what had happened.
The driver of the bin lorry was Harry Clark. He had been employed by Glasgow City Council for 4 years in several driving roles before becoming a bin lorry driver.
Harry Clark, the bin lorry driver, had gone on duty that day, and he had got behind the wheel as he normally did, and he had gone round Glasgow with his colleagues emptying bins up and down and across the city. And when the vehicle had got to the bottom of Queen Street, he passed out at the wheel.
The driver was unconscious and nobody else could interfere. The bin lorry was set up, the cab was set up in such a way as the other workers couldn't apply the brakes, they couldn't reach the steering, they couldn't stop the disaster from happening.
People had seen him through the cab window, slumped over at the wheel, and the initial story that went round was that he'd had a heart attack And so people felt that this wasn't his fault, that this awful thing had happened to him as well, that he was responsible for the deaths of 6 people, and how on earth would he live with that?
A fatal accident inquiry into the incident began on the 22nd of July 2015.
It was weeks and weeks of very detailed, long and complicated evidence.
The inquiry heard new revelations concerning Harry Clarke's past.
Prior to working for Glasgow City Council, he was a bus driver for First Bus. John Stewart is an inspector with First Bus. He told the inquiry about an incident that happened 5 years ago when Harry Clarke was driving. He said a passenger approached him to tell him that the driver of the number 54 bus had collapsed at the wheel. While Mr. Stewart was reporting this to his depot, he said the bus pulled up and Harry Clarke was driving.
The Crown decided that there would be no prosecution of Harry Clarke because there was no criminal intent. But as the inquiry went on, it became clear that Harry Clarke not only had a history of passing out at the wheel, he'd done it at least once, and he'd done it when he was a bus driver. He'd failed to disclose that he had this condition.
Good evening. The driver of the bin lorry which crashed and killed 6 people lied about the fact he had previously blacked out, a fatal accident inquiry has heard. Harry Clarke is said to have suffered fainting and dizzy episodes since 1989, but didn't declare this when he applied for a job with Glasgow City Council.
He had told his doctor that he had passed out, but he passed out not behind the wheel of a bus, but in the staff canteen. So he lied to his doctor. He lied on his DVLA application form when he was getting his licence renewed that that this had not happened, that he was fit and healthy.
Harry Clarke had the right not to answer any questions, and in fact he was reminded of this right by the sheriff before he gave his evidence. He confirmed his name and a few details. But he was asked more than 250 questions that day, and to most of them he replied, "I cannot answer."
When the inquiry ended in August, the sheriff concluded that the accident may have been avoided if Harry Clarke had provided true and accurate information about his medical history to his doctor, the DVLA, and his employer. He went on to state that the single most useful outcome of this inquiry would be to raise awareness of the dangers of driving with a medical condition which could cause the driver to lose control of the vehicle.
He did apologise, I think, through a newspaper afterwards, and said that he thinks of this every day. But on that day, for the family, certainly, I think that they felt that wasn't a view that was expressed.
Following the outcome, some of the victims' families attempted to bring a private prosecution against the driver.
Eventually it was decided that there weren't sufficient grounds for a private prosecution, and Harry Clarke wasn't prosecuted for his failure to make it clear that he had a condition that should have meant that he didn't drive.
On the year anniversary of the crash, I had gone to George Square to film a piece to camera, and there I remember meeting a woman who had been there that day, and she had come to pay her own personal respects and stand in that corner and kind of look at the crash site, and she told me that was the first time she had felt able to come back to that area.